Today's subject is the anti-hero and how the powerful meaning behind what it represents can be understood and influences us, and why someone like Nietzsche or Jung or Klages has been able to transform how we perceive morality from a good versus evil to a Faustian internal and mythologized understanding of ourselves as two halves of probably what is the whole, the holistic person, and how our own morality is constructed, I would say, from, and sometimes piecemeal, from our ability to understand our own will. So whether you have a good understanding or a bad understanding of your own will is a super important step on the journey to this redemption of spirit. So in this chat, I'll have a look at what I consider some strong motifs, the nucleus of which being this anti-hero and how it affects our perception of who we are as people, and then what we do in life, and then also our competitors, our enemies, our friends, our allies, and what we can potentially think around in terms of expanding our scope of consideration of who is actually, you say good and evil, but definitely the morality around certain people's behaviors. The first, I might start right to left here and just say that there's a book called Laughing Shall I Die, which speaks directly towards the Viking instinct of spitting in the face of death and not necessarily attributing cruelty and malice and what we'd call violent interactions as some negative, deplorable trait necessarily, and that the way we conceive today certain behaviors is very much coded in this crypto-Christian way and very understood as do not do unto others as you would not have done unto yourself, which is not traditional morality for a Faustian soul, but is this alien and exogenous forced upon almost ecumenical and scholastic version of what we would consider morality. And that Nietzsche's whole point is that you have to overcome this disbarring and unnatural feeling to realize that actually violence especially is something that's very natural, and that the way we feel in direct relation to our wills and wants is of the utmost importance here. I think Carl Jung having quite a good quote on this. He spent a lot of time analyzing both archetypes and then internal psychic mechanisms, and here he's discussing around the shadow portion of this to say anyone who perceives his shadow and his light simultaneously sees himself from two sides and thus gets in the middle. This may be attributed to Hegelian understanding of the thesis, antithesis and synthesis, but a dialectical understanding of humanity almost, or at least of the Faustian psyche. We can very clearly historically see that evil people have existed. They've just usually been alien to the Teutonic spirit. So their perception of us as invaders and as evil is just a reflection of themselves being evil combatants to us and our will. And this is why you can see the anti-hero get its formation both in historical people and almost every warlord that has come out of Europe, or some chieftain or leader, military leader, has always been seen as this complex, morally complex individual. And then we see the reflection in media, and so I'll make the transition into more popular media to give the video some pep and some gusto. I know that everyone's a big fan of bombastic speaking on certain topics, so I will try and incorporate that. I don't have any fancy editing like some of the larger channels, but what I will do is hopefully garner your attention in ways that's much more fulfilling in a soulful and existential sense, and we can see how profound these ideas can be. So I think for historical examples, maybe we will start with Cromwell He is seen as this very complex king in England, where it wasn't necessarily the case that he was beloved by all, and his puritanical motives around why he sought out power in the Roundhead and the English Civil War was very much due to his personal beliefs, and that had been attributed to God. Now, obviously, if we think about Christianity and the way that the teachings of Jesus are not centered around violence, and the means of addressing an enemy is usually one of mercy or out of some sort of kindness towards the malice. So when we consider men of God going out and forcing their will upon the world, I think the Christian or the religious aspect takes an entirely new facet, which is much more akin to traditional paganism, Germanic paganism, which is what underlying in the inner soul speaks to these men around what action and violence and passing your will upon the enemy feels like, rather than what we consider casuistry or this moral ratiocination and reasoning around why things are done and what they're done for. So there's simulacra around that, or we can discuss. But I think also Francis Drake, who was a famous privateer, which is a very classical way of describing this anti-hero, is to say a pirate and a privateer are just the same thing under different guises, or the perception of that thing is the same. So whether you're stealing ships and stopping slavers or looting and plundering, really depends on who you perceive to be the uprighteous and the good, rather than necessarily some very official, you have to be told who's a good person and who's not. History class, particularly with history teachers in high school, always come with quite a adumbration around, here's the story of this historical figure, here's why they were a bad guy, here's why they were a good guy, here's why. So the moral motives more or less around the lived experience of historical classical figures, rather than understanding them as just Faustian men expressing their souls in ways that aren't moral, and which is exactly why Nietzsche gets it right in terms of the beyond good and evil, is that it's not a consideration that any great man ever has. You don't sit there thinking, oh, maybe this is evil. You do it as you feel you need to get the result that you want. And here's why I've included Vlad the Impaler, recognizing obviously he's maybe not as Faustian in that many ways, but his ability to be perceived both as this folklore hero, but also this grand and dastardly evil. And depending on who you ask, and in Germanic folklore, stemming from Transylvania, he was able to be such an impressive villain that we have 600 years later, he serves as the blueprint for what is one of the more notoriously, you would call it nightmarish folk tales, but being Dracula and vampires in general, being associated to both Romania and Transylvania, but also the methods around his actions of beheading and impaling corpses, but then also reportedly eating blood or eating and feasting around the rotting corpses, which is where you can read this little piece here around his ability to conjure so much fear and expressing his ability to be seen as a tyrant in such a way that you can cause an entire army to lose heart and resort to cowardice, because of the way he was able to impale something like 25,000 Turks as they invaded Wallachia or Romania at that time, is monumental. I mean, it's a huge turning point in the perception of the Ottoman Empire's inexorable strength and how they were able to continue to crush their enemies. Is to say, a small kingdom in Eastern Europe was able to throw them back several times, regardless of the later outcomes, and that he was such a ferocious man that even locked up in captivity, he was used as this threat that will unleash Vlad on you, Mehmet, if you're not careful. And so the Mohammedan understanding of the rules of war changed drastically in terms of take no prisoners and the way that you treat certain prisoners of war, etc. Another good example here, and I think historically we can end, because I think you could almost cover every historical figure from Napoleon and onwards, is to say Hernando Cortez, and this is not specifically, well, this is specifically Cortez, but also many of the Italian and Spanish adventurers and explorers of that time, conquistadors, and how they were able to defeat entire continents. And if we can just conceptually understand that military history is a very large expression of Western history and global history, but in general, the Western Faustian ability to go to what is more or less savage and barbarian lands, and you have to truly understand what that means when you consider that the conquering of the subcontinent of China, of South America, of North America, that these nominally bad people in the way that they were acting towards their own populace. So there was a huge institution in India, Sati, of where wives were burnt on pyres, and that could be not seen as moralistic in almost any circumstance, if that's the kind of progress in civilization you want to see, is this moral progress as well as a technological and an economic one. In China, obviously, the Manchus and the British and European ability of the French to defeat the Manchus in their indolent empire, which was based around cruelty and such a diverse and disgusting panoply of cruel tortures and ways of waging war, and the Taiping Rebellion and things like that. And you look at South America and North America and the savage barbarity around child sacrifices and how they waged war on each other, with the complete lack of consideration around what we would call now war criminals or war crimes, and how we consider war to be almost fought with rules in a way that allows us to feel good about engagements, versus I think there's this total war aspect to, if I find your tribe, every single one, including babies, will be slaughtered. So I think you can call the Faustian man the moral good in the world, and the force for good, and this could be almost indisputable. And men like Cortez were, I think, somehow painted as these monsters in ways that's completely unfair, and then maybe anti-heroes even too strong of a conception for that. Nietzsche here, I've just gotten two quotes which I think are super important for this topic, and to say that the higher individual must realize that the ideas of the herd should rule in the herd, but not reach out beyond it. He must pay no attention to herd morality's claims on universality, its values and moral oughts, but instead must discover his own higher values to assist him in accomplishing his unifying life project. This is obviously speaking directly towards the great men and men of history. The great man is colder, harder, less hesitating, and without fear of opinion. He lacks the virtues that accompany respect and respectability, and altogether everything that is the virtue of the herd. If he cannot lead, he goes alone. He knows he is incommunicable. He finds it tasteless to be familiar. When not speaking to himself, he wears a mask. There is a solitude within him that is inaccessible to praise or blame. Which expresses the thought fairly concisely, I think, so I don't need to elaborate too much, other than to say there is a huge element of solitude that does come with what you would consider being a great man, or attempting to be the will and the Überman, because the journey is fraught with many obstacles which must be tackled alone. It's not to say you can't have allies and friends, and the pathway and the journey can't have these elements of support, but it's to say overall from end to end you will have to go most of it alone, and that if people won't follow you, then it's going to be something inconsidered in the way that you'll still pursue the goal of who you should be, and this destiny aspect towards certain deeds and quests, and why it's so important to have these deeds and quests and align them with your destiny in ways that will, I know Nietzsche loves amor fati, like the love of fate, but in ways that you can circumvent and potentially elide the fated version of your death. This is an important, I think, literary and artistic mechanism, though, when we start to get into our morally grey period, and you can consider maybe late Victorian times as when we critically self-reflected on whether we were the good guys, and there was a lot of debates in parliaments around Europe around colonialization and what exactly wars were for and why we were fighting some wars and whether that was for the moral good or the moral evil, which is obviously, once you can sense it, a decay of a sort, where there's a moral implication around enforcing your will rather than just doing it. So from the instance of Herman in the forest, in the Teutonic forests, you have this necessity around action, not a reflexive and analytical understanding of whether moral or not. And so the course of history basically crystallizes at 16th, 17th centuries in Europe for us, where high culture, high colonialism, all of these deeds are just done out of the direct tapping into the soul. There's this stream and monomania around garnering all this support towards these outcomes. Whereas once we stop and reflect, then and only then do we potentially see that there's inconsistencies in the moral logic, if that's what we've tried to build. Now, for me, it's a case that I am a believer in the Faustian destiny, where the morality of actions is not necessarily a significant factor in the discussion of whether we should or shouldn't, or importance. So there's this ought and should and could and all these sort of elements to it that I think it just needs to be done. Some good characters, I think, if you want to further explore these elements, can be around, I think, both the mediums of books but also cinema, and these, once again, I think you can conceptually tie these back to core archetypes of elements of the Viking spirit, at least in this instance. And here, maybe at the bottom left, we've got the berserker being a paragon of Viking virtue in ways that we would consider savage and barbarous in ourselves, and vicious and unnecessarily cruel. But the idea of this man so possessed with his own will to action that he's undefeatable almost in any sense of the word, that he was able to take on large armies and slay many men by himself, regardless of his own kind of bodily preserving, but also whether or not he would be able to see his friends and family. I mean, there's no consideration around the virtue of life in general, which is amazing to us in that way, and it speaks, I think, a lot to what we're willing to, like, what greatness can be achieved when the disregard is complete, basically holistic. We see, I would call it the maybe literary peak apogee in someone like Hamlet, who is not a good person by a moral in a moral calculated sense, but his motives and the way we understand him as a character is so powerful and human, at least from a Faustian sense, that his idea of what needs to be done does not necessitate a moral calculation, and that the revenge he needs to wrought upon his father's killers is something that's a destiny, and it's this quest that he must go on regardless of these other factors. And it's even something that I think haunts him and necessarily he dislikes and disfavors in a way that he has to overcome both himself first and then later on the rest of the kingdom in that way. The witch hunter, this is used, I think, historically from Spanish Inquisition, but then also throughout literature and then into modern day properties like Warhammer Fantasy, where a witch hunter is definitely seen as if not an amoral, then an immoral character who is utilizing every mean necessary to get outcomes that are largely there to protect the wider world and serve a greater good. And you can break down the utilitarianism around that, and whether Bentham and John Stuart Mill and those philosophers have created an uneven playing field around action and activity here. But the witch hunter himself is possessed with such a will that once he's determined what the outcome he wants is and how it relates back to his general destiny and purpose, then he'll go out and achieve those goals, which I find very inspiring in a lot of ways that maybe seem puerile, from the sense that you can take inspiration from what is even like children's stories and folklore, but they are still such powerful messages that I think they transcend a lot of the superficiality. In another video I have talked about this, but Harry Flashman, so Flashman is a character in George MacDonald Fraser's books who's very much seen as a poltroon and a cur, like this very immoral, and he's definitely immoral man who goes through all these adventures and comes out in the end being seen as a hero. And I think the first time you encounter him, he's such a rapscallion that you think he's not redeemable. Whereas the impression I get when you consider him after encountering something like Nietzschean philosophy in general around what we perceive as being heroic is maybe different, because his ability to overcome both the exogenous obstacles and turmoil and situations and still rise to be the victor is exactly what we perceive as being a hero. And regardless of his internal narrative and how he sees himself and portrays himself and the villainy he kind of encompasses with his moral actions, we necessarily disregard it because the way he can be seen as the hero is very evident in this is in a comedic way sometimes, but in a more relatable and he's a flawed hero rather than necessarily an evil hero. Daniel Plainview from the movie There Will Be Blood, played by Daniel Day-Lewis down here, there's a greasy man with a pipe, is an exceptionally good film, particularly if you're interested in this type of morphology. We see Daniel Plainview as once again being a very monomaniacal businessman driven to an excessive need to expend his will on achieving, and in this case, economical outcomes, which is withdrawing and extracting oil, and then obviously the pecuniary awards that come with that. And I think if we were being parsimonious, we would say he's just an oligarch or some, a wannabe plutocrat. But the idea is more related to what it necessarily takes for a man, regardless of my moral groundings, to achieve his goals. And that's the element that speaks to us. And this is a very Viking aspect of plunder, where he precisely knows that the motivations are the important part, not the perspectives and the opinions of others. And there's a lot of scenes around that deal with this element towards how he is perceived and the other factors in his life, and sometimes how they are more obstacles than they are these, having a son is not necessarily beneficial to getting what you want, and can be an obstacle rather than a blessing or a boon. And that if you are willing to disregard everything and everyone, you can obtain an outcome. And then how you feel after obtaining the outcome is varied, obviously, and that's what we get in the final. I won't ruin it for anyone who hasn't seen a 25-year-old movie, but that's fine. And then lastly, I think, a bit more flippantly, but with respect to the Guy Ritchie property of Sherlock Holmes, I think what Guy Ritchie has done extensively is develop characters which have a second layer or third layer of philosophy to them. His Sherlock Holmes is quite a unique one, and it doesn't reflect maybe the classically literature version of Sherlock, but in the same sense that I think he still understands the flawed heroics of a man like Sherlock, and what it takes to potentially be this loner possessed by a certain need, this will, and what that takes and what form that is given. Obviously this is an action comedy, so there's a lot of different media elements that you kind of have to disregard to peel away the onion. But the biggest surprise, I think, for me, was the construction of his villains, whereby in the first of the two movies released so far, Lord Blackburn here on the left, played by Mark Strong, is somehow portrayed as this very villainous, mystical man trying to jawbone England into reclaiming America as a colony using technology. So all of these really cool and interesting elements that have been discussed, both the occultism but also magic and then also technology, all intertwined into this fantastic character whose aims are very much in line with someone like Guy Fawkes, who is seen as this heroic revolutionary, but also around the understanding that we somehow think of him as evil despite his intent to take over what would have been previously a colony for England. So if you took an English imperialist perspective, he actually has the best motives, and you would want him to win. You don't really care that he's going to gas half of Parliament, because no one really likes politicians in these movies. Politicians are not sympathetic characters almost ever. So it is quite ironic, I guess, that he is seen as the villain when, if you took a look at constructing the movie from his perspective, he's for sure the good guy and the hero. He's a guy who's wanting to return England to its greatest peak of empire, uniting what would be the Anglosphere in a way that's such a, I guess, fun and interesting development. And then secondly is Moriarty, who is definitely a classic villain in the way that he's portrayed as being the equivalent to Sherlock, just evil. But once again in the movie, you understand him to be a rational actor in accordance with his own wants and wills. And now he's able to flout the law. But the law is not necessarily a guiding moral principle, is it? We've understood the law as a moral guideline, but it really is just the law and the legal structures in general are only to protect property. The very basic, and this comes to Carl Schmitt's jurisprudence, but the very basics of Roman law was around the creation of rights for property, and that the understanding that most laws are then just derived in different versions of property law, and what we consider property can vary from personal bodily property to other functions of owned property and land, etc. And land being the most important, given the preeminence here. But anyway, I think that I think for me is really good duality in how we construct villains, which aren't necessarily, if we take their point of view, villains in a very natural sense. When I think of villains like like you say, the Chinese in the 19th century, or the Indians in the 19th century, and what they were doing to their own people, which are just ghastly and deplorable and definitely immoral, then we can consider the Western European colonialization as a good thing. And then there's much more interesting elements at play between good and evil there. Whereas I think these Faustian characters, when they interplay with one another, are much more complex and in that regard worth exploring.